Vraks was not a world built for beauty or comfort. It had no sprawling oceans, no majestic cities, no fertile lands. Instead, Vraks was designated a Forge Depot world, a key munitions storehouse under the direct jurisdiction of the Adeptus Administratum, tasked solely with storing and redistributing arms, ordnance, and military-grade supplies to the surrounding sectors. Located in the Segmentum Obscurus near the Eye of Terror, its strategic value was immense. The planet's crust was hollowed out over millennia into layered storage vaults and armament silos, many kilometers wide and buried beneath concrete bunkers, ferrocrete platforms, and layered defense lines. Administratum records catalogued billions of tons of ammunition, tanks in stasis lock, and chemical weapon reserves. The environment itself was bleak: chemically scoured wastelands, ash storms, rust-coloured skies, and artificial atmospheric processes barely keeping the air breathable. Civilian life was virtually non-existent. The planet was populated primarily by indentured labourers, servitors, and administratum clerks with no say, no future, and no rights. The system worked because it had to until it didn't. Vraks' importance did not go unnoticed by the ecclesiarchy, the state church of the Imperium. By the middle of Millennia 40, the Adeptus Ministorum began petitioning to use Vraks as a place of sanctuary and retreat for its high-ranking members. The Administratum allowed this, seeing it as a minor intrusion. What harm could a few pious old men do in a warehouse world? But the church is never just visiting. In 813 Millennia 41, Cardinal Astra was granted stewardship of Vraks. His reputation was one of zealotry and iron faith, a man of sermons and sacred violence. He brought with him an entire ecclesiarchy retinue, including confessors, guards, missionaries, and his personal militia. That was the moment the fuse was lit. Zafan didn't just occupy a corner of Vraks, he claimed dominion, installing himself in the former Administratum Palace, converting it into a shrine complex surrounded by cathedral spires and weaponized faith. Slowly but surely, the church began to repurpose the labour force toward constructing religious edifices, drawing sacred iconography across supply depots, and building a theological order over a logistical one. Munitions transports were delayed in favour of moving statues. Chapel bells rang where sirens once did. Zafan was not interested in compromise. Over 2 decades, he transformed Vraks from a cold administrative hub into a theological fortress. He was a man of presence, bald, thick-chinned, narrow-eyed, and clad in crimson robes encrusted with purity seals and gold-threaded litanies. His mind was rigid, shaped by strict ecclesiarchal schooling, and framed by the belief that he alone understood the Emperor's will. He spoke rarely to outsiders, but when he did, it was with finality. His confessors, brutal enforcers of his doctrine, became de facto governors of labour sectors. Executions rose. Heresy was found even in silence. Where once servitors efficiently handled inventory, now pilgrims wept in corners, shivering under hand-carved aquilas. The administratum grew uneasy. Reports of productivity decline, malfunctions in orbital docking sequences, and delays in munitions exports flooded into the Segmentum Command. Yet the church pushed back, using religious immunity to deflect oversight, and then came the whisperings of prophecy. Zafan began speaking of visions, dreams sent by the Emperor, dreams of betrayal. He claimed agents of chaos had infiltrated the administratum, that Vraks was to be the new Terra, a sanctuary world for the faithful in a galaxy of sin. He declared the Vraksian Reformation, a declaration of religious secession from the secular arm of the Imperium. The church had overstepped before in Imperial history. This wasn't new, but Zafan had more than words. He had turned Vraks into a fortress. Its silos were overflowing. He held enough tanks and war gear to supply 3 full crusades. He had a standing defence force of 12 million men, converted guardsmen, zealots, PDF units twisted by religious doctrine. He held orbital defence batteries, flak towers, and surface-to-space missile silos. And most importantly, he had cut off all communications off-world, a theological tyrant with a planet of guns. The ecclesiarchy disavowed him to save face, but the damage was done. The Segmentum authorities refused to declare exterminatus. Vraks was too valuable, it couldn't be glassed, it had to be taken back, and that's when the Inquisition arrived. The Ordo Hereticus, under Inquisitor Lord Hector Rex, designated Vraks as a site of open heresy and sedition. The War Council of Segmentum Obscurus began preparations for an Imperial assault, not realising the magnitude of the task ahead. This was not going to be a fast deployment, this was going to be a siege. The kind not seen since the dark days of the Great Crusade, and so the Departmentum Unitorum selected the only force capable of enduring the prolonged nightmare, the Death Corps of Krieg. Descended from a history of insurrection and redemption, the Death Corps were ideal. Emotionless, methodical, and bred for attrition. These were not flashy warriors or heroic generals. These were dug-in soldiers, capable of fighting in trenches for years without breaking morale. The first regiments landed in 813 Millennia 41, mere months after the official declaration of rebellion. Krieg engineers began fortifying landing zones while Vraxian guns opened fire. The Death Corps responded not with orbital drops or thunderous assault, but with shovels, mortars, and barbed wire. They began building trenches, thousands of kilometres of them. The Siege of Vraks had begun. The Death Corps of Krieg were never meant to win wars quickly. They were designed to endure them. Born from the ashes of their own heresy during the Age of Apostasy, Krieg's culture had become one of self-inflicted penitence. Every soldier was raised in the belief that death in service to the Emperor was the only redemption for their world's past sins. They did not retreat. They did not speak unless ordered. Their faces were hidden behind thick, rebreather-equipped gas masks that filtered the toxic air of Vraks and concealed whatever sliver of humanity remained. The initial years of the siege were defined by this slow, grinding method. The Death Corps landed with 20 full regiments, roughly 250,000 soldiers, and began their advance not with mechanized assaults, but with the systematic construction of a siege perimeter around the Vraxian central fortress. This fortress was a massive complex of administratum-era bastions, silo gates, and shielded cathedrals that had been repurposed into strongpoints by Zaphan's forces. On the Vraxian side, the rebel garrison was bolstered by millions of PDF troops who had sworn loyalty to the Cardinal, supported by fanatical preachers, heretical psychers, and the twisted remains of the Ecclesiarchy's Frateris militia. They dug in just as hard as Krieg did. This was not a planetary invasion. This was a planet-wide meat grinder, and from the very beginning, both sides showed they had no interest in maneuver warfare, only annihilation. The battlefield of Vraks quickly devolved into a vision straight from mankind's darkest memory. No man's land littered with barbed wire, shell craters, dismembered corpses, broken artillery platforms, and clouds of choking dust and promethium smoke. The Death Corps shelled enemy trenches for weeks before moving forward, and when they did, it was metre by metre, men advancing under withering fire only to take one trench line, then be repelled from the next. It was not uncommon for 100 Krieg soldiers to die to gain a few hundred metres of land. Casualty rates were considered acceptable, expected. For Krieg commanders, success was measured in calculated losses. If the enemy lost more men than they did in an engagement, it was a victory. Living conditions were unspeakable. Soldiers went weeks without seeing sunlight, standing knee-deep in mud and chemical runoff, sleeping upright or in shared dugouts carved from frozen dirt. Field medics performed amputations in the trenches. Disease spread unchecked, gangrene, trench fever, lung rot, but was ignored unless it affected combat readiness. Food was rationed down to caloric efficiency, and water was often reclaimed from atmospheric moisture units or chemically filtered pools. Still, no one complained. No one broke rank. The soldiers of Krieg had long since accepted that their lives had no meaning beyond dying for the Imperium. To them, this wasn't hell, this was routine. But Vraks was not just a military stronghold, it was also a cult factory. Unknown to the Imperium at the outset, Cardinal Zaphan had been corrupted by whispers from the warp. Over decades, his paranoia and faith were slowly redirected toward chaos undivided, particularly through agents of Alpha Legion, word-bearers, and heretical sects embedded deep within the Ecclesiarchy. By the time Krieg landed, these seeds had begun to sprout. Cult activity escalated. Psychers in Zaphan's court began drawing upon warp energies to bless troops. Some rebels began to exhibit mutations, small at first, extra fingers, blackened eyes, but later more grotesque, elongated limbs, bony protrusions, and skin that crawled with invisible movement. Still, These soldiers were told they were blessed by the Emperor. They believed it. Zaphon did too. His transformation from paranoid theologian to full-blown demon cultist wasn't dramatic. It was incremental, hidden. The Death Corps remained unaware of this spiritual rot in the early years. To them, the enemy was simple: traitorous human scum with too many guns and too many fortified bunkers. But intelligence began to pick up disturbing patterns. Patrols vanished entirely in quiet zones. Gun emplacements showed signs of being warped or melted. On rare occasions, Krieg soldiers reported glimpses of red-eyed beasts in the smoke, only for them to vanish without trace. Commissars dismissed these accounts as battlefield trauma, but the Ordo Hereticus began paying attention. Inquisitor Lord Rex sent probes, sanctioned psychers, and astropathic scans confirming the worst. Chaos taint was rising across Vraks. The siege had to change tactics. Krieg was ordered to increase pressure. Reinforcements were called in, and the Munitorum began organising new waves of siege regiments, titans, and armoured companies. But for the men in the trenches, nothing changed. Every day was just more shelling, more orders, more names struck from the rolls, and across no man's land, behind those heretical bastions, something unnatural was beginning to breathe. Vraks was no longer just a rebellion. It had become a crucible, and for Krieg that meant it was time to dig deeper. By the 4th year of the Siege of Vraks, it became clear to High Command that the war would not end swiftly, nor cleanly. The enemy was not simply defending, it was adapting. New trench lines were appearing faster than orbital scans could update. Rebel forces were now equipped with better gear than expected. Surplus pattern laser guns, heavy bolters, even Lehman Russ tanks that had once belonged to the Vraxian armories. Interrogated prisoners, when they weren't too far gone to speak, claimed they were gifts from the divine, relics sent by the Emperor to preserve the faithful. In reality, these weapons were remnants of Imperium supply caches turned heretical stockpiles. The traitor forces had weaponized an entire world's worth of war gear, and now it was being turned back on its creators. A turning point came with the first breach, a calculated, brutal push by the Death Corps to take Silo 14, one of the outermost fortress layers surrounding the central citadel. The silo wasn't just a supply node, it was symbolic. Its walls bore frescoes of ecclesiarchy saints, recently defaced with burning heretical glyphs. Thousands of Krieg soldiers were funneled through a network of trenches and breaching tunnels, detonating explosives beneath the silo walls before launching a direct assault. The air turned to fire. Vraxian militia, backed by fanatics in flak robes and crude power weapons, fought with maddened fervour. In the chaos, the Death Corps employed their own brutal tactics: barrage masking, gas releases, and shovel charges, teams trained to enter close quarters and kill with trench tools when laspacks ran dry. The battle lasted 5 days. The Krieg took Silo 14, and what they found inside horrified them. The underground chambers had been transformed into shrines to unholy powers, walls smeared with blood, corpses nailed into iconographic patterns. Reliquaries once housing saintly remains now desecrated and filled with pulsating, fleshy growths. And worst of all, the air stank of warp rot, a heavy, iron-sweet aroma that clung to equipment and choked Auspex readings. The Ordo Hereticus, already observing the campaign closely, formally declared Vraks to be under the influence of chaos corruption, and Lord Inquisitor Rex authorized the escalation of the war effort. This was no longer a reclamation, it was a purge. The Vraxian response was far from passive. With growing warp influence came mutation, and the emergence of psychers among the rebel ranks. Some were uncontrolled, raving, unstable, and burnt out by their own power, but others were trained, guided by dark tutelage. Warp lightning cracked across trenches, Vox networks were jammed by psychic shrieks, a Krieg forward command post was annihilated in a single night by an unseen force, the only survivor driven mad, repeatedly carving the 8-pointed star of chaos into his skin. The enemy was evolving. The siege was no longer just a test of endurance, but of sanity. The Inquisition began identifying key cult leaders within the rebel hierarchy. One such figure was Archconfessor Torment, a former ecclesiarchy preacher turned chaos demagogue. Described as skeletal, cloaked in rust-red robes laced with chains, and wielding a corrupted eviscerator blade that hissed with demonic hunger, Torment led several successful counter-offensives against Krieg trenchworks. His voice, broadcast through captured voxcasters, was laced with sorcerous influence, reportedly inducing seizures in those listening unshielded. He claimed the war was a cleansing flame and preached that death in Xaphan's service was ascension through fire. Attempts to assassinate him failed repeatedly. Whether by tactics or warp interference, Torment became a ghost in the trenches, feared, hated, and seemingly untouchable. Meanwhile, the Death Corps' own structure remained relentlessly stable. Krieg's regimental organisation functioned like clockwork. Each siege regiment consisted of roughly 12,000 infantry, supported by siege engineers, heavy artillery teams, and grenadier companies, elite units armed with hellguns, heavier carapace armour, and often deployed during critical breaches. Supply lines were maintained with the same rigid efficiency. Trojan support vehicles delivered crates of Laspax, rations, and promethium along reinforced tracks through crater zones, while Gorgon assault transports carried entire platoons into the storm of enemy fire. But losses were constant. In a single week, a regiment might lose 25–30% of its men. Reinforcements came, promotions were rare and unspoken, men simply filled in the next line, identities blurred beneath the masks. There was only Krieg and the next bombardment. To sustain morale not through hope but ritual, Krieg soldiers adopted habits. Units carved tally marks into trench walls, not for kills but for survival days. Letters were never sent home. Krieg had no homes. Instead, final confessions were written and burned during night watch. Officers carried execution logs. If a man broke under pressure or tried to flee, his name would be logged and his body left for commissarial review. But these incidents were rare. The Death Corps were the perfect soldiers for a war that didn't end. They simply accepted that it shouldn't. By year 7, trench systems covered nearly a third of Vraks Prime's northern hemisphere, a lattice of mud, blood, and shattered steel visible even from orbit. The planetary crust in some areas had been bombed so extensively it began to collapse into the old silo networks. Entire regiments were swallowed during these void sink events, rapid depressions of surface layers into the tunnels beneath. Both sides began to fortify vertically, reinforcing tunnels and catacombs to prevent collapse. What had started as a surface war was now becoming a layered dungeon of endless warfare, each level deeper and darker than the last. Yet above it all, the citadel of Xaphan remained untouched. Its black spires sheathed in adamantium pierced the choking sky. Gunports ringed its walls. Warp storms occasionally surged around its upper reaches, distorting scanner returns and melting cogitator readouts. Rumours spread among forward squads that Xaphan himself had stopped aging, that he now floated above his altar, eyes gone white, whispering to the bones of the saints. Whether these stories were true didn't matter. Faith twisted or pure was guiding the hands of both sides, and so Krieg continued to dig. The Siege of Vraks crossed a brutal threshold when the first confirmed Chaos Space Marine elements were sighted in the northern quadrants of the Vraxian trench system. Until this point, the enemy had been primarily composed of corrupted militia, rogue PDF forces and cultists, numerous, fanatical, but killable. The sudden appearance of Astartes-level threats transformed the battlefield calculus overnight. Early Auspex logs picked up power armor heat signatures far denser and more mobile than anything previously recorded. The word-bearers, among the most ancient and insidious of the traitor legions, had entered the fray. Initial encounters were disastrous for the Death Corps. Word-bearer squads, heavily armoured in dark crimson and ash-black ceramite, swept through trench junctions with contemptuous ease. Bolters fired demon-forged ammunition, chainswords howled with warp-saturated teeth. One notable engagement, codenamed Red Collapse, saw an entire company of Krieg grenadiers wiped out in under 6 minutes by a single squad of traitor Astartes, supported by what Imperial tacticians later confirmed was a Dark Apostle and his possessed bodyguard. Those who survived described glowing runes across power armour, corrupted vox speech that drove men to madness, and one monstrous warrior who could walk through solid plasteel bulkheads. The Imperium had vastly underestimated the depth of Vraks' heresy. This new phase of war prompted a rapid escalation in resources. Heavy siege titans from the Legio Astorum were redirected to Vraks, beginning with the arrival of the warlord class Dominatus Rex. Its first action was to reduce 3 square kilometres of chaos-held trench lines into vitrified glass in a 72-hour bombardment. Orbital strikes intensified. penal legions were deployed for suicidal breaches. The Krieg were reinforced with mechanised artillery regiments wielding Medusa siege guns and Minotaur dual basilisk platforms designed to shatter subterranean fortifications. Despite this, the enemy's spiritual momentum only grew. The word-bearers were not merely aiding the rebellion, they were orchestrating it. Their rituals grew more frequent. Warp interference began to spike across the planet. Auspex began to detect temporal bleed, areas of fluctuating time compression, where Vox recordings looped or failed to register at all. Demonic incursions became an hourly event. Initially minor, these manifested as bloated nurglings, disembodied whispers, or flickering shadows that sliced through flesh without contact. But over time, more significant entities began to materialize. Among the first greater demons encountered was a herald of Nurgle, towering over the trenches near the southern arc of Ravine Delta, sloughing necrotic filth from its bloated carcass as it laughed through autocannon fire. To combat these incursions, the Ordo Malleus requested and received Grey Knight's deployment clearance, an unprecedented step. The details of their actions remain largely classified, but fragmented Pict recordings confirmed the involvement of Strikeforce Solon, led by Brother Captain Tancred, who had previously served during the cleansing of Orontes. Their presence was a clear signal to every high command echelon. Vraks had become a chaos stronghold in all but name. Exterminatus was discussed seriously, repeatedly but shelved. The Inquisition was insistent. There was something important on Vraks that must not be destroyed. Amidst this spiritual escalation, the living conditions on the planet's surface cratered further. By now, Vraks Prime resembled a dead world. The atmosphere had become dense with toxic particulates. Most troops could no longer remove their respirators outdoors. Corpses clogged the no man's land. Burial was no longer feasible, so Krieg engineers developed incineration trenches. Trenches filled with promethium and burning for weeks. The terrain was no longer recognizably planetary. It was a lunar crust of broken fortifications, chemical pits, rusted tank husks and twisted rebar, all under a choking yellow-grey sky. Rain occasionally fell, but it was acidic, reducing exposed flesh to blistered mush in minutes. In some zones, rad readings reached terminal levels, especially near the older exposed silo caps, where ancient munitions had leaked into the soil for decades. Inside the central fortress, Cardinal Zaffan was still alive, still preaching. His physical form was rarely seen, and according to intercepted rebel transmissions, he had transcended his mortal coil. These claims were not mere fanatical nonsense. Every psyker sent within visual range of the Citadel reported overwhelming psychic feedback. Several vomited blood or lapsed into comas. One astropath, despite being shielded inside a leaded observation tank, was turned inside out in a matter of seconds by a psychic backlash emanating from the fortress. The Citadel of Vraks had become a beacon of corruption, and it was now protected by etheric wards, demonic entities, and most dangerously, warp-enhanced Astartes. A particularly feared enemy unit was the warp cult warlord known as Maimon, later revealed to be a demon prince of Nurgle. Once a planetary governor, Maimon had ascended through sheer brutality and sorcerous pacts. His physical body was immense, twice the size of a dreadnought, engorged with decay and plated with rusted armour engraved with runes of pestilence. He carried a massive bile cannon and could command tides of plague-bearers at will. His presence marked the absolute collapse of any hope for a clean war. From this point forward, Imperial High Command classified Vraks as an active demon world in formation. At this critical juncture, the Imperium authorized the deployment of Exterminatus-grade weaponry, though not the full act itself. Cyclonic torpedoes were staged in orbit, awaiting the signal. But the Inquisition still held out hope for a reclamation. The Ordo Hereticus, alongside the Malleus, began drafting the next phase of operation, a direct assault on the Citadel of Vraks. Using every conventional and forbidden method available to the Imperium, it would require thousands more lives, relic-grade war machines, and even Relicta support an Astartes chapter infamous for using demon weapons to fight chaos itself. And still, the Death Corps dug. They built siege works so close to the Citadel's walls that snipers fired across less than 100 meters of space. Krieg Earthshakers began shelling day and night. Air superiority was impossible, but suicide flights were still ordered. The Citadel's void shields held. Losses soared. Medici stations stopped treating limb wounds. Amputees were simply issued stubbers and reassigned to static defence. Krieg Command began drafting pre-birth regiments. Young clones accelerated to combat readiness in mere months, lacking any identity beyond their helmet number. They too were fed into the grinder. The war had become a religion of death, and Vraks was its cathedral. By the 11th year of the siege, Vraks was no longer a conventional battlefield. The planet's geography had changed physically, psychically, and spiritually. Satellite imaging revealed massive terrain warping. Entire hills had been levelled, valleys filled with corpses, trench systems extended for thousands of kilometres in spiralling unnatural patterns. The once straight arterial supply routes now twisted and crumbled from constant overuse, sabotage and corruption. The ground itself rejected reinforcement. Vox chatter captured eerie rumblings beneath the crust. Regiments reported structural anomalies, bunkers shifting position, gates reappearing after being destroyed, and unnatural chasms devouring columns whole. Vraks had begun to mutate. The citadel remained untouched by all this chaos. It still loomed as a monolithic fortress, its walls unbroken by orbital strikes or subterranean breaching attempts. But now its silhouette was visibly wrong. Structures had been added, growths of twisted metal and stone curved into obscene architecture that did not conform to any known Imperial design. From a distance, these additions looked like Gothic cathedrals or towers. Upon closer survey, usually done by suicidal recon drones, they were made from corrupted organic matter woven with steel, bone, and screaming faces. Demonically augmented fortifications growing in tandem with the rituals inside. The word-bearers were no longer operating as raiding parties. They had taken full strategic control of the Northern Theatre. Their ranks had expanded with fresh arrivals from the Dark Council of Sicarus, and were bolstered by auxiliary cults trained in demoncraft. Wordbearer Dark Apostles orchestrated rituals in open killing fields, protected by phalanxes of possessed, obliterators, and zealots wrapped in barbed scripture. Aerial recon picked up the first signs of warp portals opening above the atmosphere, small, unstable. Tears but confirmation came later when a Hell Talon burst through an anomaly above Vraks Alpha, vomiting fire across the Krieg artillery lines. These incursions were calculated. The word-bearers were creating a beachhead for the warp, not just supporting the revolt. A second traitor legion soon entered the conflict, the Iron Warriors, cold, precise, and entirely different from the religious fervour of the word-bearers. The Iron Warriors brought with them an arsenal of heretic-engineered siege engines and demonically bound armour. They saw Vraks as both a playground and test bed. Soon, the no-man's land glittered with spined maulers, obliterators, and defiled land raiders, modified with warp plating and possessed AI systems. The Krieg's meticulous trench systems were shattered in hours by long-range warp mortars that fired screaming ammunition which phased through cover and exploded inside dugouts. The Imperium countered with a massive commitment of resources. Over a dozen more regiments of the Death Corps were redirected from staging worlds across Segmentum Obscurus. Reinforcements included siege engineers, breacher formations, and storm companies equipped with hellhounds, devil dogs, and layered explosive arrays designed to flush cultist entrenchments. High Command also sanctioned the deployment of Elysian drop troops to attempt targeted decapitation strikes against Chaos leadership. But most of these missions ended in total annihilation. In one infamous case, an entire drop platoon simply vanished mid-descent. No wreckage, no Vox traffic, nothing. In response, Inquisitor Lord Hector Rex of the Order Malleus began compiling dossiers suggesting that Vraks may now be semi-ensnared within a warp rift. The horrorscapes emerging on the front lines supported his theory. One battlefield, previously designated Grid Echo 12, was overrun by a warp storm lasting 9 days. Auspex footage recovered after the storm cleared showed the entire Krieg 128th Regiment frozen in place, literally petrified, their bodies turned to statues mid-combat. Another location saw the emergence of Slaaneshi demonettes mid-assault. These agile, sadistic killers slipped through ranks like oil, slaughtering with obscene elegance. Their appearance shattered the psyche of many veterans. Commissars resorted to blindfolding entire squads before deployment in chaos-infested zones, just to preserve sanity. Even Alpha Legion cells were confirmed present during this period. Unlike the Word-Bearers or Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion presence was minimal and surgical. Small teams of saboteurs infiltrated Krieg logistics routes, corrupted ration packs with warp spores, redirected orbital targeting data, and spread dissension via false voxes. A famous deception campaign convinced an entire Krieg armoured division that their own regimental command had turned traitor, leading to a day-long internal firefight that left over 4,000 dead, and the front line weakened enough for a word-bearer blitz. The internal cost of the war was catching up. Krieg medici services collapsed under the endless waves of wounded and chemically burned soldiers. Command began issuing exemption orders for medici stations, ordering minimal treatment for those with less than a 50% chance of returning to combat. Instead, these men were conscripted into labour crews building mass grave burners, munitions lines, or worse, suicide squads carrying satchel charges into breach points. These walking dead wore no flak, no rank, just musks and bombs. And yet, despite the madness, the Death Corps adapted. They developed new trench-fighting doctrines based on sacrificial breaches and overlapping fallback points. Entire platoons would charge, die, then be replaced by new platoons emerging from camouflaged secondary tunnels behind the same trench line. The Krieg war machine had become a sentient hive of pain, sacrifice, and ritualized discipline. Officers stopped issuing orders during bombardments. They simply raised flags, green for charge, black for annihilation, and the men obeyed without question. No cheers, no morale chants, just action, death, and replacement. And the citadel still stood. As the siege deepened into its second decade, Vraks was no longer simply a planetary war zone. It had transformed into a shrine world for heresy and demoncraft. The Word-Bearers, now operating with full authority over the southern and eastern sectors, erected warp-laced monoliths in no man's land and on captured ridgelines. These structures were not for defence or aesthetics. They were ritual spires, dimensional antennae intended to stabilise the ever-widening rifts in real space. Each was powered by blood sacrifices and psychic resonance, and protected by cultist cells embedded with demon hosts, bound warp entities sealed in human flesh. Their howling screams echoed across Vox channels, warping even encrypted frequencies and disorienting nearby Vox operators. The Imperium's retaliation came in the form of something rarely deployed, and more feared than even orbital bombardments, exterminatus protocol assets. Although Vraks was still deemed recoverable at this stage, the arrival of Inquisitor Lord Hector Rex indicated the seriousness of the Chaos infestation. An Ordo Malleus veteran known for leading sanctioned demon hunts, Rex brought with him Grey Knights, the most elite demon-killing force in the Imperium, and a symbol that Vraks had tipped beyond the conventional scope of warfare. Their arrival was not publicly announced, but became evident as reports filtered back of entire cult sectors being scoured clean in minutes, bodies vaporized, corruption seared from the land in surgical psychic purges. The Grey Knights, wearing their Aegis armoured suits in argent silver, stood apart from the Krieg line troopers. Each was a walking fortress, covered in prayer-etched ceramite, carrying Nemesis Force halberds and embedded with psi-reactive matrices allowing them to channel purifying warp energy. Their attacks were precise and devastating. Their presence meant that the enemy had summoned things beyond human capability. On one such mission, the Grey Knights cleansed a cathedral of filth, located beneath the Citadel's sewer grid, where a herald of Nurgle had taken root. The creature's destruction caused a massive biopsychic implosion, collapsing half a sector and releasing plague spores that would take weeks to cleanse. However, even with the Grey Knights in play, the enemy adapted. The Word-Bearers altered their summoning rites, decentralizing rituals across multiple hidden sites. They began fusing demon essence into living traitor guardsmen, creating demon hosts, warp flesh hybrids, and chaos spawn at a rapid pace. The battlefield was evolving hourly. The enemy no longer relied on simple meat walls and artillery barrages. They were unleashing conscious nightmares, creatures that did not obey gravity, time, or even mortality. The Death Corps had no counter to such threats beyond suicide charges and sheer numbers. The Relictors chapter of Space Marines was later deployed under inquisitorial authority, despite internal debate from other factions of the Ordo. The Relictors, long operating on the fringe of Codex Astartes orthodoxy, were known for wielding chaos-tainted weaponry against its creators. They arrived with dark relics, demon blades, corrupted storm bolters, and cursed icons purified through ritual and discipline. Their intervention at the Bastion of Silence, a former Imperial watchtower turned demon chapel, prevented a full-scale warp breach. The aftermath, however, was controversial. Survivors claimed to have seen the relictors perform rituals nearly indistinguishable from the enemies, and several Krieg commanders refused to cooperate, citing blasphemous conduct. Meanwhile, back in the trenches, the Krieg regiments were being rotated at a breakneck pace. Units once 10,000 strong were now held together by ad hoc platoons, often down to less than 500 functioning personnel. New replacements were shipped in with minimal indoctrination. These included regiments from Krieg 45th, Krieg 108th, and the Krieg Penal 9th, the latter composed entirely of death-sentence criminals conscripted for the most suicidal missions. They were given rudimentary equipment, no masks, no names, just numbers and orders to clear minefields and absorb demon charges with their bodies. Survival beyond a week was rare. The Iron Warriors, by now fully entrenched in the western ruins of Vraks Prime, initiated a new phase of siege doctrine. They built Hell Forges, mobile manufactorums run by bound tech demons and servitors, which churned out corrupted siege tanks, demonic artillery, and obliterator frames infused with warp steel. These war machines were nearly impossible to destroy through conventional means. A battalion of Krieg heavy armour, including mysterious Vulcan tanks, was obliterated in under 3 minutes during the Battle of Furnace Hill, their armour turned to molten sludge by plasma cannons that screamed like children. But the worst of the escalation came with the appearance of greater demons. The first recorded manifestation occurred in Sector 419 Delta during a routine trench clearing operation. A massive explosion ruptured the fabric of reality, and from the tear emerged Angrath the Unbound, a bloodthirster of Khorne. Standing over 30 feet tall with wings that blotted the sky and a chain axe the size of a tank, Angrath tore through 3 regiments in a single day. He decimated heavy armour, vaporized infantry with shockwaves, and resisted orbital strikes. It took the combined might of 2 Grey Knight paladins, a relictor librarian wielding a soul-bound relic, and an entire platoon of Krieg grenadiers deploying melter bombs in suicidal waves to banish the creature. After Angrath's defeat, the Word-bearers constructed a hell altar at the site of his emergence, an obsidian monolith coated in charred bones and bound demon flesh. This site became a beacon, drawing warp energies inward and slowly turning the surrounding region into a demon world microclimate. The sky over this zone was permanently blood red, with lightning storms that hissed in voices. Every night, Krieg sentries stationed nearby would vanish or return speaking in dead languages. Imperial High Command now debated pulling out. The campaign had cost millions of lives, emptied entire forge worlds of resources, and achieved no true territorial gain. But they stayed, because retreat was heresy. The Inquisition issued a renewed call for reinforcements, and 4 Titan legions were finally committed to the campaign, including elements of Legio Astorum and Legio Metallica. The war was no longer about Vraks. It was about stopping Vraks from becoming something worse, and the Citadel still stood. The final phase of Vraks' descent into oblivion began not with the thunder of artillery or the clash of armour, but with silence. A stifling, unnatural quiet settled over the central sectors of the battlefield. Vox channels went dead. Scouting drones lost signal mid-transmission. Auspex readings returned clean, but units sent to verify reported scenes of carnage, trenches turned inside out, and Krieg soldiers driven mad, not by enemy contact, but by proximity to areas now referred to in logs only as anomalous zone theta. These were the scars of unchecked warp manipulation. The warp was not merely bleeding into reality anymore, it was actively reordering it. By this stage, all major Chaos Legions had made their presence known. The World Eaters, led by the infamous Skulltaker warband, launched uncontrolled charges into Imperial lines, their chain axes sparking against the steel-hard mud of Vraks. They fought not to hold territory but to slake their bloodlust. Their arrival changed the tempo of battle, sudden, fast and terminal. Meanwhile, the Death Guard of Mortarion's lineage expanded their control in the eastern sectors. The ground around their strongholds became fetid and unnavigable, choked with bile-flooded trenches, plague pits and rotting fauna. Their war engines, including plague burst crawlers and demon engines, required no fuel. only rot, filth, and suffering. Krieg Command under Marshal Kagori initiated Operation Hailstorm, an unprecedented commitment of manpower and artillery to launch a direct assault on the citadel. The strategy was simple and brutal. Overwhelm every chaos-held trench line, redoubt and staging area with non-stop shelling and human waves until a corridor to the citadel could be burned open. This operation saw the deployment of over 30 Krieg regiments, supported by Warhound and Reaver Titans of Legio Metallica and thousands of siege tanks, from Leman Russ Vanquishers to Baneblade variants. Despite the logistical nightmare, initial progress was made. However, this offensive triggered the release of Chaos's most catastrophic asset. Deep beneath the citadel, where the original munitions vaults once lay, the Word-Bearers had constructed a warp breach containment zone, a portal into the Imperium itself, now large enough to let entire demonic legions pass. The breach, codenamed Hellmouth Alpha, flared open during Operation Hailstorm, releasing an army of horrors, bloodletters, plague-bearers, flamers of Sinch, and worse. Many were not even known to Imperial scholars. One such entity, described by witnesses as a walking cathedral of tongues and brass, single-handedly wiped out an entire tank battalion before disappearing into the fog. Facing this escalation, the Order Malleus authorized demon-side protocols across all Krieg divisions. Every trooper was issued a primer on demon identification and banishment, alongside purity seals and blessed las rounds, largely symbolic, but critical for morale. For the first time in the campaign, Krieg commanders made formal alliances with other Imperial factions. Inquisitor Rex, by now the de facto High Commander of the Vraks Crusade, ordered a rare collaboration between Grey Knights, Relictors, Legio Metallica, and Krieg High Command. Joint task forces were created to breach Hellmouth Alpha, contain it, or destroy it. These combined strikes were devastating. Relictor Terminators wielding demonic thunderhammers fought alongside Grey Knight interceptors, their psychic nulls searing demons from the inside out. Titans turned their weapons inward, walking into crumbling urban zones to lance warp rifts with god beams. Krieg sappers, in perhaps their most suicidal deployment yet, tunnelled beneath Hellmouth Alpha to lay vortex bombs, devices that ripped microholes in real space, closing portals violently at the cost of all nearby life. Hundreds of thousands died in the counterpush, but the breach was eventually sealed, its epicenter crushed beneath the collapsed substructure of the citadel's western wing. And yet, the citadel itself would not fall. Constructed from adamantium-reinforced ferrocrete, layered with void-hardened alloys, and now bolstered by warp-spawned architecture, the citadel had become impervious to conventional siege warfare. Even orbital fire from remaining fleet elements failed to do more than scorch its ramparts. Its walls were alive in places covered in pulsating flesh, veins of warp crystal, and demonic mouths that screamed or laughed. Aerial recon was no longer viable due to anti-air batteries manned by fused Chaos machine hybrids. Despite this, the Imperium pushed inward. They no longer sought control of Vraks. Their mission had narrowed to one goal: breach the citadel, kill whatever lived within, and erase the stain from existence. Within the final years of the campaign, Vraks became a case study in total war. Over 14 million Imperial soldiers had died. Entire Krieg lineages had been extinguished. Of the original garrison, not a single loyalist survivor remained. The Word-Bearers, while fractured and scattered, continued ritual warfare until the end. Their leader, Dark Apostle Cardazar, was finally killed during a direct assault on the Citadel's sanctum. A room that had once been a chapel to the Emperor, now inverted with Chaos iconography, its altar soaked in centuries of sacrificial blood. Cardazar's body was found still chanting, his larynx animated by a demon possessing his severed head. By the end of the siege, the Citadel's central spire collapsed, cracked open by the combined psychic might of 4 Grey Knight librarians and an orbital lance strike timed to the second. What remained of the traitor legions either vanished into warp rifts or were hunted down. Vraks Prime, however, was unsalvageable. The planet was declared permanently uninhabitable, designated Perdita Extremis in the Inquisitorial Index. No reclamation effort was authorized. The world was simply quarantined, watched by Inquisition listening stations, its surface haunted by both memory and mutation. In the final accounting, the Siege of Vraks stands as the longest continuous land war in Imperial history, lasting nearly 17 years, involving over 30 million casualties, dozens of inquisitorial operatives, multiple Space Marine chapters, Titan legions, and an incalculable number of Krieg. It became a turning point in Imperial demonology and warfare doctrine. Never again would chaos be underestimated in such a way. Vraks taught the Imperium that heresy, once rooted deep enough, becomes not just a rebellion, but a metaphysical infection, one that can remake worlds, people, and reality itself. And still, in the red dust storms of Vraks, there are whispers on the wind. The final act of the Siege of Vraks was neither sudden nor glorious. It unfolded with the grim inevitability of erosion. Millimetre by millimetre, corpse by corpse, section by crumbling section. After over a decade and a half of continuous warfare, Vraks Prime had become an apocalyptic ruin, barely recognisable as a functioning planet. No day passed without bombardments, and no night came without the stench of death and chemical fog. The Citadel, the final bastion of resistance, had become the heart of heresy, a colossal hive of demonic corruption and traitor entrenchment, towering above the battlefield like a tumour that refused to die. By the 17th year of the campaign, the Krieg High Command had concluded that the war could not continue in its current form. Supply lines were stretched to near collapse, morale had plummeted even by Death Corps standards, and Inquisitor Rex was under direct pressure from the senators of the Ordo Malleus to deliver a definitive result or withdraw entirely. The Astra Militarum had already lost 14 million troops. Thousands of tanks lay abandoned or half-submerged in the rust-coloured sludge. Reaver and Warhound Titans of Legio Metallica now stood frozen in place, either destroyed or awaiting the rare spares needed for critical systems. Vraks had drained more material than some sector-spanning crusades. A solution came not through tactical genius, but through a convergence of Imperial assets finely aligned in purpose. By mid-year, reinforcements had arrived in the form of the Grey Knight's Fourth Brotherhood, led by Brother Captain Arvan Stern and elements of the Exorcist chapter, a little understood Astartes force with specialised experience in demonology and demonic possession. They were not deployed lightly. Their use signalled that the threat of Vraks had officially transitioned from military to existential. With their arrival came the new objective: breach the Citadel, neutralise all warp presences, and deny the traitors any further ritual exploitation. The assault was codenamed Operation Final Mercy. It began with the systematic destruction of the last ring of defences around the Citadel's outer walls. Krieg artillery regiments, depleted to a fraction of their original strength, maintained a near-constant barrage for 6 weeks straight, focusing fire on known anti-air positions and warped bastions. At the same time, Exorcist squads performed targeted strikes using teleportation, plasma charges, and sanctified relics to destroy warp beacons embedded in the Citadel's exterior. These beacons were the anchors for the remaining rift zones, and without them, demonic incursions would gradually collapse. The final breach occurred under the leadership of Colonel Harlan Grieg, a Krieg officer whose tactical record across the campaign had earned him rare commendation even from the Adeptus Astartes. Grieg's strategy was brutally direct. A massed infantry wave, supported by Baneblade-class super-heavy tanks and hellhounds, would open the outer gates by sheer attrition. Once inside, the Astartes would launch their teleportation assault to reach the inner sanctum. Nearly 500,000 Krieg soldiers participated in this assault. Less than 30,000 survived the first day. Inside the Citadel, the structure had become something no longer obeying the laws of physics. Hallways stretched impossibly long. Walls wept blood. Some squads entered rooms that seemed to loop infinitely, while others ascended stairways that ended in open sky. The word-bearers, despite their severe attrition, held critical points with unnatural resolve. Some had merged with the building itself, their flesh becoming part of the structure, their screams echoing endlessly. In these corridors, Grey Knight librarians wielded psychic nullification fields to stabilise space just long enough for squads to advance. They burned entire wings of the Citadel down to base structure just to stop the screaming. The Exorcist took the lead in purging the lower catacombs, where evidence of mass sacrifice spanning years was discovered. Tens of thousands of corpses, many skinned or carved with hexagrammic runes, had been layered as offerings to unknown warp entities. These sites had become psychically active, emitting malignant energy waves that caused hallucinations, memory loss, and in extreme cases, madness. Battle logs include entries of entire squads killing each other due to shared delusions or being possessed mid-firefight. Exorcist chaplains moved from kill zone to kill zone, wielding flame and right in equal measure, banishing what couldn't be slain with bolter or blade. The primary objective was the throne room, originally the office of Cardinal Zaphan, now the central altar of chaos worship on Vraks. It was here that Dark Apostle Cardazar had conducted the largest ritual on the planet. Though Cardazar had been slain months earlier, his death had not disrupted the ceremony. Instead, a demonic entity of unknown class, speculated by some to be a warp prince, had taken his place. It called itself Vraks the Endless Host, and manifested as a storm of disembodied mouths, wings and eyes, constantly shifting form with each kill it made. Grey Knights and Exorcists confronted it in a running battle across shattered balconies and blood-slicked halls. The Librarian squad under Justicar Raal was annihilated in the opening salvo, their psychic defences overpowered instantly. Brother Captain Stern personally engaged the demon, wielding the blade of the Emperor's will, a relic blade sanctified in the blood of 10,000 martyrs. It took a simultaneous strike from 3 Exorcist dreadnoughts and a consecrated melter bomb, placed at the demon's heart during a brief phase lock, to finally banish Vraks. The resulting implosion cracked the foundation of the citadel itself. Afterward, what remained of the structure collapsed inward. The demonic energy sustaining it drained like a punctured lung. The Imperium did not celebrate. There were no parades, no declarations of victory. The final casualty count reached 17 million dead. Of the original Krieg siege force, less than 4% remained operational. The surviving Astartes returned to their strike cruisers for quarantine and ritual purification. No relics were recovered. The citadel was deemed spiritually radioactive. A full exterminatus was considered, but ultimately denied. Vraks would not be destroyed. It would simply be erased from history and quarantined for eternity. The Inquisition made the final ruling. Vraks Prime was sealed behind a permanent Class 11 warp containment field, patrolled by a trio of black ships and a Mechanicus monitoring station. All records of the siege were sealed under Inquisitorial Archive Lock Aegis 17, with only select chapters left accessible for military instruction. For Krieg, Vraks became their defining myth, a campaign that validated their doctrine of sacrifice. For Chaos, it was a victory in defeat, a demonstration that even in total failure, they could cost the Imperium more than entire subsectors. And in the darkness beneath the planet's crust, where even the Exorcists dared not go, some believe the rifts remain. The end of the Citadel did not equate to peace. While the structure was physically destroyed and the demonic presence within was banished, the broader reality was less conclusive. Vraks Prime was no longer a battlefield, it was a planetary-scale grave. The terrain, irradiated by prolonged shelling and warp saturation, had become functionally uninhabitable. Atmospheric processes failed to counteract the levels of chemical saturation from years of phosgene, chlorine, and rad weapon use. The air was thick with particulate toxins. Storms born of disturbed atmospheric equilibrium carried corrosive rain, flash lightning, and unpredictable pressure drops. Only those in sealed suits or Astartes armour could move about for longer than a few hours without suffering internal hemorrhaging. A full post-war assessment was undertaken by a composite delegation. Elements of the Ordo Malleus, Ordo Hereticus, Mechanicus Surveyors, and Krieg command staff. The findings were damning. The structural remains of the Citadel, now collapsed into a partially exposed crater, still showed residual warp echoes. The bedrock underneath was pitted and fractured from prolonged demon presence, and under high-intensity Auspex scanning, faint psychic signals continued to register, indications of warp bleed through. It was determined that the rituals conducted within had permanently scarred the noosphere of Vraks, giving it an unstable warp profile. Despite no demonic manifestations being present, the world could no longer be considered safe. Across the broader planetary surface, regions that once held supply depots, trench systems, or habitation zones were now fields of fused metal, pulverized concrete, and carbonized bone. The Krieg regiments, despite their survival, could not remain. Over 94% of the surviving troops were diagnosed with permanent psychological trauma or body corrosion due to exposure. Medical personnel described a new pathology, one they named Siege Wear Syndrome, a blend of chemical damage, radiation poisoning, and persistent dissociation from prolonged exposure to frontline horrors. It was quietly acknowledged by Order Malleus agents that many of these troopers were too compromised to be reintegrated. Some were consigned to Mechanicus research vessels for long-term study, others were reassigned to suicide missions in nearby systems. As for the Grey Knights and Exorcists, both chapters underwent extended rites of purification, memory scrubbing, and genetic resilience testing. Grey Knight brother Captain Avan Stern, already a veteran of the Demonofuge campaigns, petitioned the Conclave for a full codification of Vraks' incursion events into Librarium Daemonica records. His report was direct and unsentimental. Vraks proves the limits of attrition warfare against the immaterial. It is not blood, but belief, that fuels our enemies. The Exorcists, though far more secretive in their post-battle accounts, quietly confirmed that Vraks had hosted at least 2 unrecorded lesser chaos gods, entities likely birthed from accumulated psychic suffering over the war's span. These beings, while banished, had demonstrated unique manifestations unlisted in existing chaos taxonomies. The administrative ruling followed shortly after. Vraks was to be declared perdita extremis. No future Imperial settlement or exploitation would be permitted. A Mechanicus quarantine station, designation 4R-VX Sentinel, was placed in a geostationary orbit to monitor long-term warp behaviour. Black ships from the Ordo Hereticus would conduct B-decade passovers to screen for any potential emergent psychers born of latent warp influence. A single astropathic beacon was left functional, broadcasting a Class 5 interdiction warning to all passing vessels. Do not approach, do not land, do not pray. The Administratum removed the planet from standard star charts. Logistically, it was no longer considered part of the Imperium's working assets. In the decades following, the Vraxian campaign entered legend, not through victory celebrations, but through its clinical use as a military case study. Tacticians studied the logistical decisions, the siege rotations, the integration of Titans, the failure points in armoured assaults, and the cumulative cost of an extended static war against traitor forces. Doctrina Strategium texts produced by the Schola Progenium now list the Siege of Vraks as one of 3 examples of prolonged doctrinal friction against cultist insurgency and warp-corrupted command structures. It became a textbook example of how a localised rebellion, if not neutralised early, could metastasize into a conflict rivaling an entire sector war. One of the least discussed topics was the fate of Cardinal Zaphon. While presumed killed during the early purge by Inquisitor Rex, later findings in the lower catacombs suggest he may have endured far longer. Ceremonial remains found among the warp rituals bore his ecclesiastical sigils and bore partially preserved tissue consistent with his genetic markers. The Ordo Hereticus theorized that his body had been used as a host or catalyst in an extended binding ritual, effectively fusing his being into a component of the demonic summoning process. Whether this made him victim or architect remained unconfirmed, but his spiritual legacy was unmistakable. A once holy world turned into a demon world in all but name. The Krieg regiments, for all their sacrifice, gained no celebratory return. Those few who survived were redeployed immediately, many to the siege lines of Valhax Beta, or to the trench moons of Segmentum Obscurus. Krieg High Command did not issue medals. Their doctrine does not accommodate individual heroism, but within their ranks the name Vraks became a marker. Those who had served in the campaign were called the Grey Sons, not for their armour, but for their silence. Veterans of Vraks seldom spoke again, and some developed obsessive behaviours, such as digging trenches even during rest periods, or requesting to sleep beneath soil mounds. A full third of these veterans voluntarily entered redemption cadres, committing themselves to campaigns from which no survivors were expected. In contrast, the word-bearers and affiliated traitor elements experienced internal fractures after Vraks. The loss of so many cultists and the failure to complete their primary objective, transforming Vraks into a stable demon world, triggered schisms. Surviving members of Cardazar's host splintered into warp-faring warbands. Some became pirates in the Eye of Terror, others integrated with Black Legion elements. A handful took with them warp artifacts created on Vraks, trophies of pain and agony used in future campaigns to anchor fresh rituals. Imperial forces encountered these devices decades later on Agrellan, Nova Collapsis, and even in the Ghoul Stars. Their presence was unmistakable. The legacy of Vraks, even in failure, travelled far. At the macro scale, the siege had exposed a chilling truth that Imperial response mechanisms, even when precise, could be rendered almost irrelevant by the tenacity of chaos worship. The system-wide lockdown, the deployment of multiple Titan legions, the Grey Knights, and the sheer cost in lives all had failed to prevent the spiritual desecration of a single world. For every Vraks purged, another world would fall more quickly. This was the unspoken lesson that Auto-Strategist recorded but never spoke aloud. Yet despite everything, Vraks was not fully lost. It had been denied to chaos, and for the Imperium, that was the closest approximation to victory they could afford. The aftermath of the Siege of Vraks extended beyond tactics and trauma. It became a mythologized point in the cultural memory of the Imperium. The Administratum and Ministorum moved quickly to control the narrative, recognizing both the strategic and spiritual danger of leaving the story of Vraks in the hands of independent chroniclers or local rumour. The Imperial Creed could not afford ambiguity. Official versions of the campaign, vetted by Ordo Hereticus scribes and delivered in Vox script to millions of Schola Progenium and Ecclesiarchy institutions, described the events in blunt absolutes. Traitors rose, the faithful responded, victory was claimed at great cost. No mention was made of demonic ascendancy, of the Citadel's warp rituals, or of the thousands of corrupted Ministorum clergy. Instead, Vraks was framed as a redemption through sacrifice, a monument to perseverance in the Emperor's name. The narrative weaponization had clear intent. In the years that followed, the martyrdom of Vraks became a required chapter in the Officio Prefectus officer training texts. Imperial Guard commissars were taught to cite it when morale flagged, framing Vraks as a symbol of enduring loyalty rather than a horror of failed containment. The Krieg regiments, despite their silence, became part of propaganda reels across the segmentum. Simplified and beautified illustrations of masked stoic soldiers braving storms of fire were commissioned en masse by Ministorum artists, many of whom had never seen real combat. This canonization through visual media ensured that Vraks' truths, its whispers of psyche sacrifice, demon anchors, and warp echo scars, would be buried beneath layers of pious fiction. Those who questioned the official account were quietly monitored or removed. Among the Adeptus Mechanicus, Vraks became a forbidden name. Forge Worlds near the Scarus sector issued circulars flagging any data requests containing Vraxian pattern, VX-class signal bleed, or Citadel Schema 1014B for immediate tech seer review. Research logs recovered from Mechanicus observers on Vraks showed evidence of impossible material behaviours, metal that remembered injuries, Vox networks that picked up ghost code, and Voxcasters broadcasting prayers in languages not registered in known STCs. Several engine seers claim to have detected warp logic embedded within architectural layouts of the lower citadel, suggesting that the facility itself had been designed as a ritual vector from its foundation. Most of these logs were seized by the Ordo Malleus. A few fragments survived, circulating among rogue tech priests as Heretech legends. Within the Inquisition, Vraks became a focal example for debate over the threshold of exterminatus. Some argued that the world should have been glassed once chaos influence was confirmed, regardless of the billions of lives at stake. Others maintained that its strategic value and symbolic status as a holy world made such a decision politically unviable. The internal dossier compiled by Inquisitor Rex, now restricted under Code Obsidian-level security, records that he petitioned for exterminatus authorization 3 times during the campaign. Each was denied by High Lords citing morale destabilization risk. The dossier closes with a handwritten addendum. Faith delayed is faith bled. The Grey Knight's Codex Daemonica was updated to include a full case study on Vraks, specifically in its appendix on prolonged demon-sustaining conflicts. They concluded that persistent death and spiritual anguish on a single world could serve as a warp battery, enabling the birth or empowerment of demonic entities over time, even in the absence of formal rituals. Vraks had functioned as a pressure chamber for belief, despair, and martyrdom, both for traitors and Imperials. It was a finding that disturbed even the most experienced demon hunters, as it implied that chaos did not always need to infiltrate or tempt. It merely needed humanity to suffer without clarity. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the fate of Vraks' surface post occupation. Scavenger vessels who attempted illegal landings in subsequent decades reported seeing ghost lights, unregistered energy flickers, rising from the old battle zones. These phenomena were said to take the shape of banners, war horns, or screaming trench lines. Some crews vanished entirely. A penal legion deployment in M40.289 to test the viability of reclamation encountered immediate breakdowns of discipline, rapid onset psychosis, and 3 separate instances of mass suicide within 72 hours of landfall. No formal report was made. The sector record simply updated Vraks' tag from Perdita Extremis to Noctis Grade 1, Warp Echo High. To the Krieg regiments, the name Vraks remained a shadow. Veterans never spoke of it openly, but among Death Course doctrine circles the term Vraksian Protocol became shorthand for engagements where the full annihilation of enemy morale and infrastructure was required, regardless of collateral cost. New recruits studied the battle maps, terrain logistics, and trench rotations, but the deeper context, the spiritual erosion, the internal betrayals, was redacted. Krieg Command viewed this as necessary. As one senior quartermaster wrote, "It is not our role to understand the wound, it is our role to bleed until the wound closes." Outside Imperial space, whispers of Vraks persisted. Rogue traders, chaos cultists, and Xenos lawkeepers each maintained fragments of the truth, filtered through their own distortions. The Eldar of the Alitok craft world marked Vraks as a place of shattered soul echoes, a node of warp interference that bled into adjacent timelines. The Dark Mechanicum occasionally referenced the Vraks paradox, a concept suggesting that the planet had briefly hosted a demonic presence powerful enough to fracture linear perception. Whether this was true or propaganda meant to destabilize Imperial historians remains unknown. But for the Imperium, none of these matters were allowed to take root in the common mind. The Imperium operates on controlled myth, and the truth of Vraks was too raw, too complex to be of use. So they buried it beneath silence and monuments. Since statues were erected on distant worlds to commemorate the martyrs of Vraks. Prayers were written and recited in cathedrals by priests who had never seen a bolter wound. And the trench lines, the endless rows of blood-churned soil and twisted rebar, were left to be reclaimed by chemical storms and warp-scorched winds. In the end, Vraks was not just a battle, it was not even a war, it was a transformation, a slow, grinding exchange of flesh for faith, of reality for narrative. It proved that the Imperium does not win its wars through strength alone, but through endurance, through its capacity to take horror, grind it into doctrine, and wear it like armour. Even if that armour is cracked, rusted, and soaked in the screams of the forgotten. And so the siege ended, not with the raising of banners, but with the quiet burial of truth beneath a mountain of sanctioned lies. Vraks did not merely fade into the background of the Imperium's countless war zones. The planet's name became a warning cloaked in reverence, cited only in whispers by those who recognized what it truly was. A cautionary tale of bureaucratic pride, religious inflexibility, and the high cost of inaction. In the years following the siege, the Administratum and Ordos reshaped the conflict into state myth, filtering it through the machinery of Imperial record-keeping. Its horrors were systematized into protocols and lexicon. Entire departments were created or restructured based on Vraksian precedents. Within the Adeptus Munitorum, logistics templates referencing high attrition compliance, Vraks pattern, became commonplace in trench-based theatres. Across the segmentum obscurus, penal legions were increased by over 30%, bolstered by data extrapolated from the mass deployment survivability figures gathered on Vraks. Doctrine evolved in ways both subtle and severe. The Krieg assault methodology, formerly seen as fringe, was quietly studied and implemented in extreme cases. The Death Corps' cold, sacrificial efficiency proved irresistible to Imperial command elements seeking quantifiable reliability. Their model of minimal battlefield autonomy, mechanical obedience, and acceptance of total attrition was deemed ideal for drawn-out sieges. Several newly raised worlds, particularly in conflict-heavy zones such as Armageddon and Cadia, incorporated variations of Krieg-style indoctrination into their Schola Progenium facilities. This included reduced exposure to outside culture, increased religious conditioning, and rigorous exposure to death through corpse processing roles. The Imperium had learned a lesson, if not of mercy, then of control. The Siege of Vraks also left a permanent mark on the ecclesiarchy. After the exposure of the Cardinal's heresy, the Ministorum intensified its internal purging practices. A newly formed suborder within the Adeptus Sororitas, the Order of the Sanctified Audit, was tasked with inspecting ecclesiastical holdings for signs of corruption, warp residue, or deviation from high Gothic prayer structures. Within 2 standard decades, over 700 minor cardinals and 4,000 preachers were condemned for heresy under protocols derived from the Vraxian Conflagration Codex, a document internally circulated within the ecclesiarchy. While many were likely innocent, the shock of Deacon Varn's betrayal meant that the Ministorum no longer gambled with ambiguity. Faith became quantifiable, measured in rigid doctrine adherence and bloodshed for the Emperor's name. The Grey Knights, though largely absent from public accounts, maintained a detailed archive of Vraks. Their librarians dissected the engagements frame by frame, noting particularly the prolonged warp activity in the Citadel's foundations, and the resilience of the demonic presence even after the ritual was halted. Vraks had revealed a phenomenon that would later be identified in other war zones: psychic saturation of terrain due to high volume, spiritually charged deaths. In subsequent years, Grey Knight codifiers would flag 4 additional planets: Stygia Prime, Idumea, Soloth, and Graia Gamma Fambian, as exhibiting similar warp-bleeding patterns. These worlds received immediate inquisitorial attention. None were allowed to reach Vraks level escalation. The Inquisition had learned its lesson, even if the price had been 10 million Krieg dead. The Navis Nobilite, too, began implementing no-go protocols for regions that registered persistent warp anomalies post-conflict. Vraks became a case study for the dangers of ghost real space, areas in which navigational paths became unstable due to bleed-through from the Imperium. For warp travellers, the lingering effects of a world like Vraks weren't just spiritual, they were navigational hazards. Ships that flew too close to the system reported time lapses, overlapping echoes in Vox signals, and mechanical degradation of core systems despite clean diagnostic returns. These anomalies led to the establishment of new warp lane designations that diverted around previously stable sectors. Vraks had scarred space itself. On the more covert end of Imperial society, Vraks ignited a cultural undercurrent among forbidden sects and fringe cults. The Heralds of St. Varn, a warp-infected death cult operating from deep hive levels in Necromunda, claimed Vraks as sacred ground and called for a pilgrimage to the Soil of Trials. Members were known to tattoo Krieg trench maps across their bodies, speak only in corrupted versions of the Imperial Creed, and consume warp-tainted soil stolen from black market dig sites on the planet's surface. Similarly, certain tech heresies began to cite Vraks as a place of machine memory, claiming the Citadel had housed a non-STC intelligence that briefly achieved warp awareness. These theories were condemned by the Ordo Malleus, but not before several Mechanicus research outposts were found abandoned, their occupants having vanished mid-experiment. Military regiments, particularly within the Astra Militarum, began adopting honour traditions derived from Vraks. Some Cadian divisions instituted a custom where soldiers smeared ashes across their breastplate before deployment in siege conditions, a silent tribute to the Death Corps. Certain commanders kept relics, spent Krieg respirator filters, trench knives, or mud-stained field caps as symbols of perseverance. While the Krieg themselves would never acknowledge such acts, the myth of their sacrifice had taken on a life of its own. Vraks had become a crucible of meaning. Every scar, every dead world that followed seemed to echo its example. And yet, not all lessons were learned. The Ordo Tempestus, in its quest for elite shock troopers, reviewed Vraks not as a cautionary tale, but as a missed opportunity. Several post-Vraks doctrines leaned heavily into overwhelming early assault using scion regiments and mass teleportation deployment. These operations, while initially effective, suffered under extended engagements, precisely the kind of trench slog Vraks had exemplified. Still, commanders insisted on the doctrine. The lesson they took was that Vraks had failed not because of poor decision-making, but because they hadn't hit hard enough at the start. It was a dangerous oversimplification, and in multiple conflicts, particularly the Heraxis cleansing, it led to near disaster. Meanwhile, among the Death Corps themselves, the legacy of Vraks was felt in silence. No monuments were constructed in Krieg cities. No honours were given. but internally regimental designations rotated in a pattern that subtly maintained continuity with the Vraxian formations. The 261st Siege Regiment's field doctrines became embedded in new PDF training cycles. The 88th's ruinous attrition ratios were kept as cautionary tables in junior quartermaster curricula. On Krieg, war is the only history worth remembering, and Vraks, despite its unspoken trauma, was remembered meticulously. The most chilling legacy of Vraks came not from those who served, but from those who studied it. A classified think tank within the Ordo Hereticus compiled a multi-volume analysis known as the Tithing Spiral, which documented every Imperial logistical failure, psychological breakdown and doctrinal blind spot that Vraks had exposed. Among its most damning conclusions was this: the Imperium of man is not designed to prevent heresy. It is designed to react to it, to survive it, to bleed it out slowly and with grandeur. That phrase alone was deemed so corrosive that the manuscript was sealed under PSI lock and hidden in a black ship vault. Still, Vraks remained. Long after the trenches fell silent, long after the storms died down, it stood as a broken, whispering world, a caution buried beneath banners. It had shown the Imperium what happens when doctrine outpaces awareness, when loyalty is weaponized, and when war is allowed to become religion. It was a world bled dry, its purpose fulfilled not in victory, but in becoming a lesson no one could afford to admit they needed to learn. In the decades following the siege, the planet Vraks was officially declared sanitized by the Adeptus Administratum and the Ordo Malleus, but the reality was far more complex. The atmosphere remained thick with contamination, both chemical and spiritual. Long-term atmospheric testing revealed high concentrations of phosgene derivatives, warp-fluctuating isotopes, and particulate remains from countless munitions, making recolonization efforts untenable. Vraks was classified as a quarantine world, falling under Ordo Malleus jurisdiction, and was removed from the normal purview of Segmentum Obscurus trade routes. Imperial Navy patrols were tasked with enforcing an interdiction zone extending 2 AUs from the planet's orbit under threat of immediate execution for breach. The world was no longer considered salvageable, it was now a wound. The terrain of Vraks, once a modest, barren dust bowl used for logistics and armament storage, had transformed into a continent-spanning graveyard. Trenches still stretched across hundreds of kilometers, fossilized in ceramite residue and ashfall. Massive craters bore the residue of atomic shells fired by Krieg artillery during the late siege, their depth ranging from 200 to 700 meters. Melted steel, slagged bunkers, and collapsed manufactura dotted the horizon like diseased lesions. Entire valleys were filled with the crushed remnants of armoured columns, Lehman Russ tanks buried in formations like tombstones, bane blades severed in half by plasma bombardment. None of it was ever cleared. The Adeptus Mechanicus declared the scrap too spiritually compromised to be reprocessed, citing fluctuating machine spirits, anomalous vox chatter, and unexplained power fluctuations in nearby devices. At the heart of the devastation lay the shattered ruins of the Vraxian citadel. Once a towering fortress capable of withstanding a planetary siege, its remains were deemed permanently warp-tainted. Servitors deployed to assess the site ceased functioning within minutes. Several attempted to kill themselves, behaviour unheard of in neural gelded machines. The Ordo Malleus deployed psychic dampening towers around the area, as well as constructing 3-kilometre wide sanctified perimeters reinforced with null iron pylons imported from Cadia. No attempts were made to excavate further. It was determined that the citadel's foundations were too deeply corrupted. Within the Ordos, it was quietly suggested that something had been awakened beneath Vraks, a dormant entity not fully expelled by the Grey Knight's intervention. Flora and fauna were almost non-existent. Native life had always been sparse due to Vraks' dry climate and limited water cycle. After the siege, what remained was eradicated by environmental collapse. The few biological specimens recorded by Mechanicus probes included mutated carrion birds with necrotic lesions and blind rodents feeding on the bones of Krieg dead. One bizarre mutation, catalogued as Xenoform Designate 217-5, was a parasitic insect that nested within spent lasergun cells, drawing energy from residual charge and using it to fuel its breeding cycle. It was deemed heretical and annihilated by orbital sterilization beams. No larger fauna were observed. The ecosystem had regressed into a broken, irradiated loop of microbial and scavenger life, barely qualifying as biosphere. Structures across the planet showed varying degrees of architectural entropy. The original Gothic industrial aesthetic of the citadel and supply bunkers had been mangled beyond recognition by constant shelling. Still, remains of fortification layers were visible beneath the destruction. Metre-thick walls of adamantine and ferrocrete, labyrinthine corridors once meant to house ecclesiarchy scribes, and shattered chapels lined with blackened Aquila statues. In some cases, Krieg engineers had excavated under the structures, leaving behind narrow tunnels lined with detonation craters, evidence of sabotage missions during their final push. The Adeptus Ministorum's ecclesiastical structures were among the most desecrated. It was there, among cracked reliquaries and burned confessionals, that psychers later reported hearing echoes of false sermons and screams spoken in reverse. The level of civilization had effectively returned to zero. There were no functioning cities, no surviving infrastructure, no organised settlements. Yet despite this, Vraks attracted attention. Rogue psychers, heretic warbands, and radical inquisitors saw it as a place of forbidden pilgrimage. There were reports of cults attempting to land on the planet to retrieve artifacts, bones, or corrupted weaponry. The Inquisition's Vigilant Gate facility in orbit catalogued 47 unauthorized landings between 900 millennia 41 and 09 millennia 42, most of which ended with complete loss of contact. It was believed that warp residue still lingered in the planet's upper crust and atmosphere, causing navigational errors and cognitive dissonance in those exposed too long. Even inquisitorial retinues began refusing prolonged assignments. Despite this, the Imperium did not destroy Vraks. Several high-level requests for exterminators were denied by the High Lords of Terror. The planet was considered informationally vital as a case study. Ordo Hereticus archivists argued that its lessons could not be replicated elsewhere. Additionally, whispers within the Adeptus Mechanicus suggested that unknown STC fragments or Xenoarchaea tech had been unearthed during the siege and were still buried beneath the citadel. Tech priests from the Divisio Archaeoxenologists lobbied for limited excavation rights, citing detected gravitational anomalies in the substrata. These requests were denied by the Order Malleus, citing a 0.87 probability of latent warp breach. Even in silence, Vraks was watched. Technologically, the region was locked in temporal stasis. Vox signals remained distorted, machine spirits became unresponsive, and Auspex returns were often inverted or scrambled. Surveillance Auspex drones sent by the Officio Logisticae returned with looping footage, showing the same trench for hours before abruptly self-destructing. Some theorists within the Inquisition believed that time itself had begun to fragment in localized zones around the citadel, leading to recursive decay, a phenomenon where entropy repeated itself on different planes. These theories were dismissed publicly, but not disproven. Vraks had become a place where physics itself resisted Imperial understanding. Across the galaxy, Vraks imagery permeated Imperial art and propaganda. Statues of Deathcore grenadiers were erected in several segmentum obscurus bastions. One such monument in the hive city of Valon's Gate depicted a lone trooper planting the Imperial flag atop a mountain of bones. In truth, such a moment never happened. No one had ever conquered Vraks in a traditional sense. But the myth had value. It gave meaning to sacrifice. It turned trench rot, plague and slaughter into virtue. Within the Scholar Progenium, Vraks became a test subject in tactical education, its maps studied not for strategy, but for endurance modelling. Cadets were taught the names of key ridgelines and trench sectors as scripture. Knowing where the 14th Krieg Regiment had bled to death was considered a rite of passage. Yet not all who remembered Vraks did so with reverence. Some Krieg veterans, those few who had survived the entire campaign, were left mentally broken. Placed in isolated recovery stations in distant sectors, they rarely spoke and never reintegrated into civilian life. In the rare instances where they did communicate, they spoke not of glory but of the screaming dirt, a reference to a phenomenon where the very mud seemed to cry out as men died in it. Their testimonies were recorded, then sealed. The Death Corps themselves considered these men failures. Their names were never placed on the regimental memorial boards back home. Silence, for Krieg, was the only acceptable form of remembrance. At its core, Vraks became a paradox, a war fought for nothing that meant everything. a battlefield of such total loss that it was studied not for what was gained, but for how much could be endured. It was not a war of movement or manoeuvre, but one of ideology, where every shell, every charge, every death served to affirm the Imperium's monstrous resilience. No treaties were signed, no peace was ever declared. Vraks ended not with a victory, but with a silence so complete it terrified even the Ordos who had orchestrated it. The Siege of Vraks has endured far beyond its physical conclusion, embedding itself deeply into the psychological and cultural fabric of the Imperium. For the Adeptus Administratum and the Ecclesiarchy, Vraks became a narrative of sacrifice and penance, used frequently in sermons and political broadcasts. Propaganda disseminated throughout the Segmentum Obscurus framed the 500-year campaign as a holy war against corruption, heresy, and sedition. It was recounted in operatic performances, devotional picked captures, and instructional hymns, often stripped of the more disturbing realities of mass death and stagnation. In reality, the war offered few strategic gains. Its value, instead, lay in what it symbolized: the Imperium's willingness to grind heresy into the soil no matter the cost. The Departmentum Unitorum used the lessons of Vraks to refine models for attritional warfare. Tactical simulations based on Vraxian scenarios became standard curriculum within the Tactica Imperialis. Krieg regiments were rotated into trench siege exercises based on Vraks terrain, using adjusted oxygen levels and contaminated mud samples to replicate conditions. Loss tolerance thresholds, metrics for acceptable casualties before units were considered combat ineffective, were recalibrated using Vraxian data. Even weapons development shifted subtly. Newer designs for lace guns and power packs included increased resistance to dust and corrosion, based on equipment failure reports from Vraks' last decades. In a brutal twist, Vraks helped make future wars more efficient in suffering. For the Inquisition, Vraks became a scar that would not close. Ordo Malleus records of the final phase remain sealed, even to other branches of the Inquisition. Those who fought at the Citadel's core, most notably the Grey Knights, never released full transcripts of their engagements. Speculation from less orthodox elements within the Ordo suggests that an artifact or entity had been buried deep beneath the planet long before the apostate cardinal took residence. Some inquisitors pointed to the presence of multiple cults, each drawn to Vraks independently, as evidence of a deeper warp resonance within the soil itself. These theories remain officially unacknowledged but privately archived. Vraks also reshaped the image of the death cause of Krieg. While their origins were always bound in shame, from a planet nuked by the Imperium for its heresy, their conduct on Vraks recast them as paragons of loyalty. The staggering losses they suffered, their total refusal to retreat, and their relentless devotion to duty cemented them as the Emperor's silent angels of death. In Krieg society, survivors of Vraks were revered not as heroes, but as sacred vessels of pain, living testaments to what it meant to serve without hope. New recruits were shown footage of the Vraxian front as part of their indoctrination. Images of stormtroopers vanishing into clouds of phosgene, or Krieg grenadiers advancing through fields of corpses, were used to steal the minds of future generations. The psychological consequences of the Vraks campaign were profound. Reports from off-world medici stations indicated an unprecedented spike in combat fatigue collapse among non-Krieg regiments who had rotated through the front. Despite the Imperium's disdain for mental health terminology, some rare administratum reports labelled the phenomena as battlefield disassociation syndrome, where soldiers lost all sense of time, loyalty, or self-preservation. Particularly affected were the Elysian drop troopers assigned to orbital interdiction during the later stages. When they returned to their homeworld, several formed underground suicide cults, worshipping what they called the Quiet God, an entity they claimed whispered from Vraks' surface. The Ecclesiarchy classified the cult as heretical and had it purged within a week. Among the most unsettling long-term effects were the occasional warp anomalies that radiated outward from Vraks, even centuries later. Rogue traders and scout frigates passing within a 5 light-year radius occasionally reported system malfunctions, hallucinations, or ghost signals containing Krieg Regiment Vox codes. One such signal, intercepted in 19 Millennia 42, contained a looping broadcast from Krieg's 103rd Regiment, requesting reinforcements at Trench Line 917A. The coordinates pointed to a zone obliterated in 832 Millennia 41. no living units remained from that position. The signal, confirmed as authentic, repeated every 23 hours for 6 consecutive weeks, before stopping without cause. The legacy of Vraks also touched the broader Imperial war doctrine. While most military theorists viewed the siege as a case study in inefficient strategy, others, particularly those in the Schola Progenium, saw in it a reaffirmation of discipline as the highest martial virtue. The idea that wars could be won not through tactics or innovation, but through sheer persistence and sacrifice, gained traction among senior commanders. Campaigns in the Caradon war zone and Octarius cluster adopted similar siege philosophies, pushing their regiments to embrace attrition-based victories. This doctrine became known colloquially as the Vraksian solution, a grim acceptance that some wars must be fought by slowly bleeding the enemy, regardless of how much Imperial blood was spilled in return. The theological implications were just as stark. The ecclesiarchy, after initially framing the siege as a holy purge of heresy, began to shift its messaging in the centuries that followed. Sermons began to emphasize the notion of martyrdom without glory, a spiritual trial in which no grand moment of salvation is promised, only an eternity of suffering for the Emperor's vision. Vraks, once used to rally the faithful, was now held up as a cautionary tale. Pilgrimage to the system was forbidden. Preachers were warned not to romanticize the siege. A quiet understanding took hold among the senior cardinals of the Ministorum. Some wounds were too deep for faith to explain. From a strategic perspective, the failure of the Imperium to prevent Vraks from descending into rebellion, then corruption, then near extermination, served as a damning indictment of its administrative brittleness. The planet had been designed as a logistics node, quiet, isolated, efficient, and yet within decades it had become one of the largest heretical strongholds in Imperial history. The lesson was clear to those willing to look. The Imperium was not too big to fail. Even the most mundane worlds could become nightmares if vigilance faltered. Several reforms, including stricter ecclesiarchal oversight of supply worlds and enhanced inquisitorial rotation schedules, were instituted as direct consequences. But perhaps the most haunting part of the Vraks legacy was the silence. No memorials were ever built on the planet. No statues mark the final death toll. No children sang hymns of victory. The world was left to rot, both as punishment and as warning. Ordo Reductor satellites still orbit it, equipped with atomic warheads in case a new warp breach emerges. Among certain circles in the Ordo Malleus, it's said that Vraks isn't dead, just dormant, and one day the screaming dirt may awaken again. Vraks was never redeemed, it was never rebuilt, it was never mourned properly, it was simply endured. That endurance, cold, unwavering, unyielding, is the true heart of its legacy, a shrine of ash and blood dedicated not to triumph, but to the Imperium's terrifying refusal to break.